I'm really excited about this one. All right, well, I'm going to kick off. So morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this thought leadership webinar titled The Role of Story in Building a Better World. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter and author, Alina Siegfried. So a little bit about Alina. She actually originally studied geography and worked as an urban planner back in the day. So she can empathize with a lot of your work. Alina is a storyteller, a narrative strategist, systems change advocate, TEDx speaker, and New Zealand Poetry Jam champion. Spoken word artist with the stage alias Ali Jacs from Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand. After a stint as an urban planner, Alina's journey in storytelling and communications has taken her through environmental advocacy, political issues campaigning, social enterprise, crowdfunding, arts and community development. In her role as the founding communications lead of the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, she has helped bring together a global community of 500 world-leading entrepreneurs, investors, artists, and systems change leaders to develop transformative solutions to pressing global challenges. So it is my pleasure to invite you to this, to welcome you to this IPWEA platform where we represent infrastructure asset managers in New Zealand. We're a membership association for local government engineers and infrastructure professionals. And we're here to support you in building better practice and facing the challenges that are varied that we face in our work today. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Alina and invite you to take the stage.
Thank you, Frida. That was a lovely introduction. Morena koutou, it's lovely to be here. Wonderful to see at least a couple of you. I can't see most of you, but that's all right. I'll trust that you are there on the other end of an internet connection. I'm going to share a short presentation with you first this morning about the power of story to help build a better world and help change systems. Then I've got a wee poetry performance for you. And then I think in the second half, we'll have a Q&A. I'd like to leave a lot of time for the Q&A and have a good discussion around this topic. So I won't present for too long, but I am going to dive into that now and share my screen if you'll give me a moment. And we'll have a short interactive section as well towards the end. So everybody can see that? Maybe a thumbs up.
Yep,
cool.
See it clearly.
All right, lovely. Just going to get rid of all your faces here for a moment so I can actually see my slides. Right. So, yeah, ko maukatere te maunga, ko waimakarere te awa, ko Cressy, ko SS Australis aku waka, ko Pakeha, ko Witehana aku iwi, ko Alina Siegfried tapo ingoa, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. See, I've got some pictures up there of Maukatere or Mount Grey in Canterbury, which is my maunga, my mountain, the Waimakarere, and the Cressy and SS Australis were some of the waka that my ancestors came to Aotearoa on. So today we're going to be talking about storytelling for change, really, or storytelling to help bring about a better world. And just to outline my theory of change with the work that I do, I see that a better world comes about through changing the systems upon which we have built our lives and societies and our cities and our countries, and that changing systems really is about changing culture, because it is human beings that have designed and built the vast majority of the systems that we have around us. They are anthropogenic systems. They are things that have come about from the human world, not from the natural world. And because we were the ones who built them, we are the ones who have the power to change them. But because they are culturally built, we need to look at the culture, and any culture that you look at is built almost entirely on story, narrative, and myth. So these are the narratives, the high-level stories that we tell ourselves about essentially the way things are. I've got a quote here from Yuval Noah Harari, who's the author of *Sapiens*. Any large-scale human cooperation, whether a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, is rooted in common myths that only exist in people's collective imagination. So that speaks to the idea that really everything that we've come up with in the anthropogenic world is built on a common myth or a story that we collectively believe. And just to go into what I mean by myth, it's become a little bit of a dirty word these days. And in my view, I think there's a great need to reclaim the word myth. These days, myth has become synonymous with lies or falsehood. We hear, trickle-down economics is a myth, or climate change is a myth from some sectors of society, but it essentially has come to mean a theory that isn't true, or a theory that we believed before we knew better. Whereas originally, the word myth was something very sacred and powerful. Myth contained certain human truths that were wrapped up in a story and enabled humans to be able to cooperate on large scales together with a shared common belief. And in the book that I'm going to be publishing in a little under a month's time, I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but and the whole final section of it actually takes 10 of the current narratives that I see underpinning the world, the way the world works, or at least the way the Western world works, and introduce 10 new myths or mythic narratives for humanity to be able to take us towards a future that is more regenerative, equitable, and just. If we look at story at a personal level, I found this on a meme many years ago, and I've tried as much as I can to find somebody to credit this quote to, but try as I might, I can't find a source. So, but it really resonated with me. So life is not made up of a series of events, occurrences, and circumstances, but rather our interpretation of a series of events, occurrences, and circumstances. So really, with anything that is going on, or any issue, we bring multiple lenses and filters by which we look at information and apply our own story to it, or our own narrative. And our own narrative very much comes from myriad factors involving the way we were raised, where we were raised, our background, what our beliefs are, what our political leanings might be, all sorts of factors there. And just to drive that one home, I really enjoyed this shorter quote too by Ines Nin. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. So again, that's speaking very much to the fact that it is our own interpretation and lens that we see the world through that influences our conclusions about things. So why story? Why should we focus on story? We've got all of these, problems or challenges in the world, many of which you folks are looking to help solve through infrastructure and public works. Essentially, humans are hardwired for story. They are what I call the operating system of the human brain. We often think in our age of advanced science and engineering and technology that we have triumphed above our irrational, messy human selves, and that we're very, very rational these days. But we really are driven much more by story than we are by facts and figures. We are emotive creatures, and we are messy and complex, and at times very irrational. So Story builds bridges to shared meanings between people. It's an opportunity to communicate our values in a way that people understand. And there's that emotive piece to it. Story really reaches hearts over minds, which is, often the way that we really make decisions. Even if we think that we make our decisions with our minds, we're driven by emotion much more than we often recognize or realize. One more quote here speaks to the emotion of what I've just spoken about from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And in essence, that quote perfectly captures for me the power of story. I want to dive briefly into the DNA of story, essentially. And what I mean when I'm talking about story. So at the top of that pyramid is framing and language and the words that we use every day and by and large we take for granted. So I'll use an example here. If we are to take the framing of natural resources, which many of you are involved in managing and looking after, and the term natural resources inherently implies that the elements of nature that we find are resources that are there for human use or human consumption. So even in that very short phrase, 2 words, natural resources, there's a whole story there around our relationship between ourselves and these other elements of the natural world. So that's at the very tip as our choice of language. Underneath is story. So, if we're talking about natural resources, we might talk about Thomas Savery or James Watt, who were involved in the development of the first steam engines and using coal fire to harness the power of nature. So that would be the story, a very specific thing with characters, beginning, middle, perhaps not end, because we're very much still building on that story. Underneath is narrative. So perhaps the narrative in this example is the fact that we assume, or it's a given, that the elements of the natural world are there for the taking and that we can harness them. And then beneath that is perhaps is the myth, and that's the very, very deep, largely subconscious stuff that is very rarely questioned and really underpins our understanding of the world and the way that the world works. So in this example, the myth might be that humans are a discrete species that are completely separate from nature, or that we are dominant over nature. And again, they're largely unspoken things. They're things that we don't even think about or recognize most of the time. But the reason that this does take up the most space at the bottom, and that it's at the base of the pyramid, myth and narrative, is that they are highly influential on the way that we structure everything in our lives, even if they are subconscious. Flipping up the pyramid now, you might hear me talk a lot about systems change. And that's very much where a lot of my passion lies, in not necessarily changing just one thing, or coming up with solutions for one problem, but really trying to understand a whole system. And as engineers and public works professionals, you'll all be quite familiar, I think, with systems. At the top level of this pyramid, 6 conditions of systems change, is policies, practices, and resource flows. So these are the things that we're perhaps most familiar with when we're looking at changing systems. We've got specific policies that might come either from governments or within organizations. You've got practices, better supply chain practices or employment practices or sustainability practices. You've got resource flows. So, where is the money coming from to help us become more sustainable, or help us become more equitable employers, or whatever it might be. And philanthropy and charity and the NGO sector also sits in here. So it's very much the structural, explicit stuff that we're familiar with. And in many ways, it is the low-hanging fruit of systems change, because it's tangible, it delivers results, you see an ROI, you're able to objectively measure it. At the semi-explicit level is relational change. So looking at our relationships and connections, perhaps between different players within a whole system that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. Within organizations, we're very familiar with the people that are in our organization, but what about the ones that are, one or two steps removed? And then again, power dynamics too is an interesting one. And we're seeing some more of that, that kind of stuff being named with the large scale social movements around Black Lives Matter, or gender equality and the Me Too movement. Those things are starting to be named a bit more. And then right at the bottom here is our implicit level. This is where the transformative change happens. And this is where narrative and myth very much live. And again, it's largely subconscious, but it is probably both of these lower levels are where I see the most potential for creating change, and they are also the levels that are given the least amount of attention at this point. And so my work very much squarely sits within these lower two levels. So in my book, as I said, I do present 10 new myths for humanity. And again, I'm talking about myth as in an inherent truth wrapped up in story, not as in lies. And some of the ones, I'll just give a few examples so you can get where I'm coming from. We have a narrative very much in much of the Western world around individualism, around individual success, individual effort. Perhaps we might extend that to our own family or little bubble. But when we talk about we, it's probably pretty insular. And social media, of course, and tribalism is exacerbating that. But the new myth that I present is that we is much larger than we often tend to believe. We might even say that we can be viewed as all of humanity. From there, I take it to the next step to say that we have a current narrative, as I spoke about before, that we are dominant over nature. Nature is there for us to use, and we might try to, develop sustainability practices to do it in a more or less harmful way, and strive to be kaitiaki of the natural world. But what I'm suggesting is a reframe to say that we humans actually are inherently part of nature. So what we do to nature, we do to ourselves. And that might sound a bit woo-woo, and there's a semi-spiritual component to it there. But I mean, even if we were to look at, some biophysical truths to the fact that we are constantly exchanging atoms with the world around us, and the idea that around quantum mechanics, with nature responding to conscious observers and so on, there's some interesting stuff to explore here. By and large, the narrative of many nations and many of our cultures is that the key to a good, a happy, successful life is to accumulate a lot of material wealth. We get these messages from when we're very young that it's good to try and earn more and more money. We hear that when GDP is rising, this is a good thing, and that growth is inherently good. So there's a reframe here of that current narrative that the key to a good life is accumulating more stuff and more wealth, to actually a myth of most of us have enough. So a real shift in mindset there. And then tied into that is this idea of moving from a narrative of scarcity, which we just see in so many of our daily interactions, to one of abundance. And I mean, if we were to look at something like, food as a model, much of the scarcity that we see around the world, the fact that a lot of people around the world don't have enough to eat, this is not what I see as a natural scarcity, but it is manufactured scarcity that comes about through our processes, our systems, our economic structures. Particularly when we think about the fact that roughly 1/3 of the food that is produced in the world is wasted. It is never eaten by anybody. So that's a huge problem, and that's very much tied in with the narrative of scarcity that goes along with our economic system. So that's all well and good, but what does it all mean for public works engineers or folks like yourselves? So I'm going to just offer a couple of provocations here. As Frida said, I did begin my career as a planner at Rangitikei District Council, and I've also worked in environmental advocacy and freshwater policy as well. But it certainly isn't my area of expertise. So I'm not going to tell you or attempt to tell you, how story might apply to your jobs, but I am going to ask a few questions, and that's what I like to do best, is to challenge you to think about what is the story or narrative that you hold about what you do. So if you were to, give me a one-line spiel about your job or what you do, and why you do it, what would that be? And I'm actually going to stop sharing now because I'm going to invite you all to put something in the chat about what it is that you do. And with your permission, I'm going to pick out one of them, and we're going to dive a bit deeper into it. So just, a one-line narrative of what it is that you do in your job. I'll give you a couple of minutes to put those into the chat.
I'm going to have to be the mean teacher and just pick someone out. Oh, excellent. Well, we've got some coming in.
Cool.
So I've got, a couple. So would you like me to read those out, or you can see them, can't you?
I can see them. Yeah. Oh. Yep. We might wait for one more to come in. And what I'm going to do next is actually to take you through an exercise called 9 Whys. And I find with asking these questions, that what is the story or narrative of what you have and what you do, thinking about whose story is this? Is a story that's been handed down to you by the organization that you work for, or is it one that's intrinsically motivated and comes from yourself and your own personal values and passions about why you do what you do? And looking at alternative ways of framing that story and telling that story to be to hit hearts rather than just minds. I want to go through this process of starting with why. And so let's see, we've got a couple more on here now. Okay, I think we're going to, Bridget, are you open to coming off mute and having a bit of a chat with me around your one?
Sure. Hello.
Kia ora. Cool. Thanks for volunteering to be the guinea pig here. So we're going to go through a bit of a process now. I'm going to ask you a bunch of probing questions about what you do and try to get to the real why of what it is that you do. So you've said, I work on transport research and policy to improve inclusion in the built environment. Let me ask, why do we need inclusion in transport research and policy?
Why do we need inclusion? For me, my gut reaction to that question is because it's not fair at the moment. It's not fair. Some people aren't treated the way I want to be treated.
Okay. Why isn't it fair?
Because they're not there. Because some people, it's not fair because some get more than others out of what's around us. So some people find it harder to do things that other people take for granted and find easy.
Okay.
So it's not fair. It's not the same for everyone.
Okay. And why should it be the same for everyone?
It should be. I think the reason that it should be the same for everyone is that we say that it is. So it's a mismatch between, we're kind of delusional. We pretend that we're an egalitarian free country, that everyone has the same opportunities, but they don't. So it's a problem because we're lying, and lying's bad.
Great. And why does it matter to you that you're lying?
I think because I was raised Catholic, and every morning at primary school, we're like, treat other people as you want to be treated yourself, and care for poor people, you know, really obvious words like that, like people who don't have as much as you. Your life should be about looking to help people who are worse off, and not just perpetuating, you know, comfort and success for people who already got it all.
Yeah. Cool. We'll stop it there, but you can see the process that we're going through here. And I mean, the exercise is called 9 Whys, but really you don't have to necessarily ask the question of why, but the intent behind this is to really drill down on what is the real reason and the real story behind what you're doing and why you're doing it. And for you, I heard a lot of your values coming through around caring for the poor and making sure that things are fair and just, and why that matters to you. And by and large, people can't really argue with that when you're speaking from your values, because it is your story. It's not something that's objective that people can rationalize and go, well, you know, this report says that, you know, that we shouldn't care about people. So very much the exercise here is, you know, it's a sort of a fun, you know, yeah, very, very casual thing to go through, but it can often yield really interesting results around where we're actually coming from and what our values are. So I'll go back to share screen. I think we might be pretty close to the end anyway here. Oh, we don't want that. We want this one. Can you see my screen again there?
Yep.
Okay, yep. So encourage you to just go back to that previous slide and think about what's the story and narrative that you have of what you do. Whose story is it? Is it your story, or is it a story that has been handed to you, or is it a story of your team or your manager? What might be alternative ways of framing that story in a way that considers more people and actually takes us towards a path of being more sustainable, regenerative, and equitable. And I am pretty much finished there. So I've just got a few details there about my book, which is coming out next month. It's called A Future Untold: The Power of Story to Transform the World and Ourselves. And it's got a lot of examples from my own life and career, lots of anecdotes and so on, as well as some solid research behind it as well. So at this stage, I'm actually going to stop, and I'm going to share a poem with you. This is the first spoken word piece that I ever performed in a poetry slam. And a poetry slam is a silly poetry competition by which everybody gets 3 minutes at the microphone and are cruelly judged by audience members who are holding scorecards. But all that aside, I'll give you a little bit of the background to this poem. I was working in a freshwater policy role for an environmental advocacy organisation in Saskatchewan in Canada, central Canada, and working a lot on a water conservation campaign. Often we saw droughts in the summer months. And I decided that I was going to put myself on an extreme water conservation challenge, whereby for a month I used no more than 25 litres of water per day to meet all my daily needs. So that was cooking, flushing, bathing, laundry, everything. 25 litres is not a lot. It's one of those sort of, those plastic carry cans, you see the blue ones, and about that much square. So I wrote this poem essentially. I haven't had a shower in 28 days, and it's fair to say that nobody executes a sponge bath quite the way that I do. I've earned my black belt and a PhD in the ancient art of sponge bathery. Tomorrow's job? Bucket laundry. Is my plumbing broken? Is my bathroom being renovated? No, this is about me using my voice, and this is about those who have no choice. And the reason I do this is to make you think how much water was used when you were last at the kitchen sink. And between your ingrained habits and the taxes you pay and the ability of your grandchildren to freely play in a lake devoid of blue-green algae, between the energy used to pump sacred life into your homes through subterranean water highways, between all of these things, can you make a link? 25 litres a day is all I'm allowed this manic month of scribbling and jotting. I am the calorie counter of the water world. And now I realize with the sharp clarity and the sudden compulsion of somebody who's rapidly losing her footing in the crumbling sandstone on the brink of an OCD chasm, why diets never work. I want to etch on your minds with a water-based ink. And I want you all to be thinking about how much water you use and how much you abuse. I've been labeled alarmist, a crazy hippie and more, by those trolling from the far side of a distant keyboard. Now, as I measure out bathing water, I can almost already feel the sleek ribbons of cascading warmth soon to be delivered by my trusty yogurt container. This sponge bath is earned, and I'll enjoy it more than ever before that I've reached out to turn on that shower dial. Up the stairs with my bucket, I can't afford to slop. I can't afford to waste a single drop. Into the bathroom, ready to go with my luxury steaming H2O. No! Tragedy has struck. In my haste, I have stumbled and spilled my bucket. I watch my efforts drain away, blue gold on porcelain in the bottom of the tub. And now I must walk downstairs, measure out more water, and return to the stove with it. The novelty's worn off, and at this stage, I'm over it. Still, I walked down 16 stairs, and it sure as hell beats 16 miles. From a sun-baked village on a dusty road, a woman with a jug on her head she goes, and where this woman she goes, she walks with her hopes, and she wonders if anyone hears her story. In 3 short days, my stand of solidarity comes to an end, but I will not forget. Her story echoes in each drip of a leaky shower head, in every careless flush. The weight of her clay jug sits on my shoulders each time I see somebody turn their back on a running tap. Tomorrow's wars won't be fought over a thirst for oil, but over thirst in and of itself. With 3 days to go, I'm struck by the irony that water makes up 70% of my body. So when the wells run dry and the fields turn to dust, I wonder, will they be coming to tap me? Thank you. So the funny thing about that poem was, after I performed it in the poetry slam, I had people coming up to me for weeks and months later telling me about all the ways that they have been trying to conserve and save water. And I had been running these, dry, excuse the pun, quite dry and boring PowerPoint presentations, explaining the rationale of why people could save water and how much they could save. But after performing this poem to a room of about 100 strangers, I had people seeking me out and excited to tell me how they were saving water. So that was the first big epiphany for me around the power of storytelling to encourage behavior change and reach people on an emotional level. We've got about another 20 minutes left here for just a Q&A and open the discussion. If you've got any reflections or thoughts you'd like to share, or any questions, by all means. Perhaps, Frida, we do a raise hand kind of a system to keep things flowing, if anybody's got something they'd like to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So either raise a hand or you can throw a comment into the chat. Just while you're thinking about
Christine.
Christine, excellent.
Wonderful poem, Alina. That was amazing. You remind me a little, your poem reminded me a little of Kathy Jetnall-Kitchener from the Marshall Islands. I don't know if you've heard of her.
I think someone, yeah.
She did an incredible spoken word poem like that. She's a climate activist at a UN Assembly, a climate summit. And my question actually was around how do you tell people a narrative, or how do you tell people a story about water, and you've just done it so beautifully, when they already have a narrative in their head that's based on misinformation. For example, they live next to a lake with beautiful clean water, so therefore they have a myth in their head that water is abundant, we shouldn't have to pay for it, we shouldn't have to conserve what we use. And maybe you've already answered it with your beautiful poem, because that's my question.
Good question. And I mean, it works on multiple levels, right? So I think there's everything from the top of that pyramid, as we saw before, down to the foundations. And even with your choice of language and framing and the messages that we're creating, we can talk about the value of water and what we appreciate about water. Perhaps in the scenario that you talked about, it could be finding stories that actually both simultaneously support that narrative that you're wanting to perpetuate, but at the same time might point out the flaws in the way that they might be thinking about that water system. So it could be, a story about a user at the other end of the lake that's having some issues, or it will be highly context dependent, of course. And then making sure that in your organization's high level narratives that you really are speaking to your values and why you care, and what it really means to have that relationship with the water.
So what you're saying too, though, what I'm hearing you say implicitly is that you don't have to try and necessarily counteract that false narrative, but you just give them a new narrative. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, and to some degree, myth busting can actually be quite counterproductive. So when you try and speak to you think this, but therefore this, the way that we listen and attach meaning to things is we latch onto the things that already reinforce what we think already. So if you were to say that, their brains go straight to this is the narrative that I already have, and might discount what would have said after. So there's a fair amount of social science that's gone into the process of myth busting or trying to counter views with, you may be thinking this, but this. I think in certain circumstances it can be helpful when there is a deeply ingrained view to just mention it, but you wouldn't want to focus a lot on it, because, as I said, the social psychology of it is that people just latch onto that belief that they already have, and that's what they hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's some fantastic work if you want to look into that further by the Common Cause Foundation. Yeah, just Google that. Frida.
Oh, and Bridget's next. This is a quick one. Someone was talking to me recently about starting any interaction or meeting, like preparing beforehand, asking yourself, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, Alina, to ask yourself, how do I want people to feel and think at the end of this meeting before you've even entered the room?
Yeah.
Why? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that quote that I had from Maya Angelou, and that people don't forget how you make them feel. We forget the details of those meetings that are months or years gone, but we always remember our emotions or the state that we were in afterwards, because that's basically what being human is all about at our core. So yeah, certainly you could think about what do I want from the outcomes of this meeting, and how do I want people to feel, and what would be the stories that would be conducive to that feeling and that would invite people in, rather than, as I said, myth busting or pointing out what's wrong. So it's really speaking very much for, framing your stories in terms of what you are for and not what you're against, and also using personal stories wherever you can, because nobody can refute those. And there's long been a reluctance in many business or organizational settings to bring any sort of personal narratives into your work. But I think we are seeing some changes in that, and there's certainly a lot to be gained by recognizing that a business or an organization really is made up of the people that work within that business and organization, and they all come with backgrounds and lenses and filters about how they see things. So don't be afraid to, I guess, use your personal stories, and if you are, at the higher levels, by all means, nurture a culture within the workplace where it is safe to do so. Bridget.
Hi, thank you. That was a good segue, actually, because my question is about how do you encourage a creative confidence in the people that you work with, because you're obviously a very confident and, I would say, talented storyteller and creative person. I really like poetry. I started a hashtag engineers who write poetry on Instagram a while ago, and it didn't really go viral. I guess a very big hashtag.
It's a work in progress.
Yeah. And you kind of get some people who look at you sideways, but some people really like it. But I wonder if you've got thoughts on different ways that we can encourage creative confidence. Like, I've got a lot of young colleagues, like I'm only 40, but I'm very old in my organization. And, is there a creativity in using memes or using TikTok, or should we be really open-minded in the method for the story to bring people with us? Because a lot of the people I work with are quite shy about finding their creative voice, especially when they've been trained as engineers and their identity is wrapped up in being good at maths and spreadsheets.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a very good question, because people are so used to bringing a certain version of themselves to their work. I think, what some of the things you mentioned there around different forms of allowing stories to be with memes and TikTok and so on are great if you can get on board with them, and that your customer base or your audience will respond to such things. Even just creating certain processes at work where there is a forum for practicing and flexing that muscle of storytelling a bit more, even amongst those who it's not their job to tell the story. I'm not just talking about the comms or marketing team, but for others. I have a practice of opening storytelling workshops by asking people to get up and share a roughly 1 minute story from their childhood that they remember and that taught them an important lesson. It's got nothing to do with their work. It's got nothing to do with what they do day to day. But it really gets people into that creative mindset of just telling a story and letting it be, and not having that story have to have a purpose. You can get into that later when you are crafting your messages for an intended audience, but just getting people out of their analytical heads and into their, I'm a human telling a story about my childhood kind of frame of mind. So just inviting those kind of opportunities, perhaps.
Thank you. That's really, really good. Thank you.
Anybody else got any questions or comments?
I've got another one if no one else wants to say.
All right, go nuts, Bridget.
Yeah, why not? I'll take this show over. So I just liked what you said about not dissing other people's worldviews straight off the bat. Like, I've found that I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and if I do a post saying you're all delusional and renewable energy is a waste of time and electric cars are stupid, that gets way more reactions than if I put a picture of me smiling on my e-bike. Like, everyone loves the positive, oh, look at you, isn't that great? Like, it's so much, like, you've just kind of enlightened me as to why that is. It's because people don't want to be told they're doing it wrong. They want to see something they can do. Maybe you could expand on that, but
yeah, absolutely. And that is, very much about stating what it is that you're for rather than what it is you're against. And we're conditioned in many ways to, especially if you see yourself as any sort of an activist or an innovator or somebody who's trying to solve things or change the status quo, then it's tempting to point out everything that's wrong with the system. But that isn't what inspires people, and in many ways, it's what people it gets their defenses up, and they want to argue back with you and point out all that's flawed in your argument. Whereas, if you put, as you said, a picture of yourself smiling on your e-bike, it's very unlikely that someone's going to come and say, oh, you think that you're so environmentally conscious, but actually, these are the facts and figures that point out blah blah blah. It just doesn't happen, right? And by and large, it's so the modus operandi that we see on social media, with people wanting to myth bust and point out what's wrong. I'm going to share just a link here. I was going to do this poem for you all, and I decided to do the water one given the audience that I'm talking to today. But I have a poem about political polarization and social media that you can check out on YouTube if you want to. But it's really about telling the story, your story, because nobody can argue with that. Make it personal and make it positive. And if you want to get into the science of storytelling and the brain chemicals that are released when we see positive news stories of dopamine and oxytocin and so on, they make us feel good. Whereas when we're arguing or if you're posting something that can, people are tempted to refute, then the brain is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline and all of those fear-based chemicals. And so, it's, if we're looking to change behavior or get people to change, certainly what you want them to be feeling good about that change rather than fear-based messaging. And in some ways, I think that's what we're getting wrong around a lot of the climate change messaging. Is that it's all fear-based and obligation-based, and we have to act because it's going to be too late, rather than, I quite love this planet, and I quite love, living in a stable atmosphere and having a future for my children, and speaking again from your values.
I love that. I feel like if I start talking, I will never stop. So I'm just going to leave the floor.
Yeah, we've got a few more minutes if anyone's got a question or even just a reflection that you wanted to share, or a story. we've got any stories lurking, then by all means.
I feel like this would be great if it was like fortnightly. Like rewiring the heart space back into the work we're doing, and actually that being the missing puzzle piece to building better in terms of also changing the language. So taking it out of this abstract, I feel like you hear the words climate change and it's overwhelming and your brain nearly switches off. And as a yoga teacher, I have learned that, I love how you pepper science, like evidence and data through your talk, Alina, because it's like, well, actually, scientists have found that we go into our prefrontal cortex where our best creative thinking and problem solving happens when we feel safe and relaxed. So it's nearly like creating psychological safety. So if people come to a meeting and they're like, you're wrong, what you think is wrong, like boom, brain switches off. Rest of it is a waste.
I see Michael has raised his hand.
Hello, Alina, great talk, thank you. I suppose I've got a question around something that challenges me in the so transport, dealing with the decision makers in council and AT. The whole myth is around congestion. You know, you upgrade a road, provide more capacity for cars, and that solves the problem. And it does short term on that link, but it broadens the problem of congestion, and the short term solution makes a bigger long term problem. So I've thought about how to address this, but it is very much in the challenging space. And, you know, as Bridget pointed out, there's a lot of people with careers in this space who are used to saying things, doing things a certain way, and effectively challenging that. So have you got any pointers? So not a public conversation, but a conversation amongst professionals to try to change the way they think.
And I think, I mean, what you're describing is very much grounded in the current paradigm of forecasting. And we see a problem, we forecast what it's going to look like in the future, and then we take steps to solve that problem. One of the newer paradigms that I'm seeing is this idea of narrative foresight. And what that is essentially is a visioning of the future. So if you were to sit down with and it might take a few goes to try and get them on board, but if you sit down with a bunch of executives and say, what does your ideal future of transport look like? Like if money was no cost, if policy, if culture was not a barrier, what do we actually want it to look like in this transport utopia? And from there, actually working backwards in the process of backcasting, if you will, to say, well, what are the barriers that are holding us from getting there, and how might we work backwards step by step to ensure that we've got a better chance of getting to that future? Because otherwise we are just stuck in the predominant way of, this is the way that we've always done things. And in that regard, there's a certain I guess, blue sky thinking, or dare I say it, even naivety around some of this stuff, and thinking, what are possible futures? But the way I see it, if we're always stuck in the status quo and basing our future solutions on what we know in the present and in the past, then we're always going to just repeat those mistakes of the past and the present. So there certainly is something to be said for creating space for that really, imaginary blue sky thinking, what if scenario, and then trying to figure out what are the steps that we can work backwards to try and have a better chance of getting there.
Thank you. That makes sense.
There's a question from Emily in the chat here around my top tip for water conservation after my 25 litre a day challenge. Great question. I mean, short showers is a big one. Investing in a front-loading washing machine can make a lot of difference. I was going to some pretty extreme measures that I don't necessarily expect that people will replicate, such as taking my sponge bath water and flushing the toilet with it afterwards with grey water. And while we might not do that, as an actual physical process, There are certainly, fantastic models out there of grey water use. I think in a lot of the smaller or geographically constrained countries in Japan and Singapore and so on, where the grey water system is very much built in to using that water for things like flushing the toilet and so on, where you don't need 100% best quality potable water.
Alina, just a question. So I really appreciate what you shared.
I'm struggling to hear you, Glenn.
Okay.
Your audio's
Yeah.
not great.
Okay, let's see if I can. Is that better? Can you hear me?
A little
Yeah.
bit. It's just quite echoey. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So that vision sort of narrative foresight that you talked about seems quite safe. Like it's a safe conversation to have. But talking about underlying myths start to get really fundamental to a person's beliefs and seems like a much more of a minefield kind of space to walk into. So how do you, could you just talk to that a little bit, or your experiences then?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, as you said, somewhat of a minefield if you're just to come out and say, these are some myths that I'm thinking or talking about. I think with a lot of it, you need to be sort of adapting to your audience, and as I spoke about, speaking from common values can often help in identifying what are the things that are, I wouldn't say 100% undeniable, but reasonably undeniable in terms of what people want or believe that the purpose of infrastructure provision is for, or what a healthy, good quality life looks like. Sticking to the values is a softer introduction, I think, than going straight into myth. Certainly with the myth conversation, I probably wouldn't be heading into conversations with big executives around that right away. There's a reason that my 10 myths come in the final section of my book, after I've spoken a lot about values and a lot about storytelling and shifting current social narratives, and that it all comes together in the end as these mythic narratives. But I wouldn't be leading with them, certainly.
Okay,
all right, I think we've hit up against 10:30.
We have, and people have seen a few huge thank yous and apologies they've got to jump off.
Good. Yeah. Thank you for all joining us today. It was a very engaging conversation, and wish you all a good day.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in a few words. Firstly, to thank you, Alina. I just think that the idea that we've reached a point where we know everything is an illusion. We never have, no discipline's ever like, oh, hey, like geography's finished now, we've figured it all out, and so I love that people cannot unlearn what you've put into their minds today, and I think that's really powerful. It's going to color how they enter interactions and how they do their work and how they structure their narratives. So your ripple out effect is really exciting for me. I think we're constantly evolving, and maybe bringing the heart back into business will be a good thing. And a little plug to the few remaining people, we've gone a minute over, that there are another couple of amazing webinars coming up over coming months. And let's just keep this conversation going. So big thank you, Alina, and look forward to buying your book.
You're welcome. And I did put a link there in the chat window too, if you want to learn more about the book.
Yes, yeah, I'll be emailing that out to everyone. Great.
Lovely. Hey, thanks so much, Frida. Thanks for having me. Thank you, everyone, for coming along.
Excellent. Pleasure.
See you later.